27. Education as a religion. In the United States, it has been customary to regard Adolf Hitler as a man who was at once both a stupid and an amusing figure, albeit a vicious one. There has thus been little intelligent understanding of the rise and triumph of National Socialism in Germany, where it was destroyed only from without, and hence no ability to cope elsewhere with these same dangers which are endemic to modern culture. Hitler not only controlled the most educated and advanced of modern states, but he thoroughly commanded the loyalties of educators and scientists because he understood and was able to use their myths and tools. The genius of Hitler in its grasp of modern realities is sharply seen in his soliloquy at an automobile show. Strange that these machines and all the thousands of other machines in our factories should be changing the human character, but they are. The man who drives his car at top speed has developed a totally new set of reflexes. He does not think any more before he makes a move. There is no time to think. For his own safety, he must react with lightning-like speed. There, he must act automatically, almost like a machine. A good part of his energy goes into automatic reflexes instead of into thoughts. That is why in our day and age the number of people who think for themselves is dwindling. It is possible to assert, and with very good cause, that the machine can be an instrument of liberation, but the fact remains that culturally, modern man has seen fit to liken himself to a machine, deny his transcendence to the material order, which has again often been seen mechanistically, and to pattern his life to the machines. With Hitler, all these aspects of modern culture were deliberately accepted and utilized to create a post-Christian and scientific barbarianism. Before Hitler's rise to power, José Ortega y Gasset had called attention to the coming scientific barbarism in The Revolt of the Masses, citing its origins in 19th century civilization, in particular its liberal democracy and technicism. One aspect of Hitler's goal was noted by Erika Mann in her study of School for Barbarians, but she failed to recognize the importance of the emphasis on science. What was the significance of the Nazi approach to education? The matter can be briefly summarized as follows. 1. For National Socialism, man was truly man in terms of the group or the state, and the true state was an expression of the folk, in their case the Germanic folk. 2. True education and true psychological and spiritual health required the acceptance of the group and one's racial identity. 3. Scientific objectivity was seen as mythological. Every conclusion represents a point of view. 4. Modern science was nonetheless basic to National Socialism and essentially to its new order. Science and scientific methodology must be both furthered and dedicated to the service of the state. Thus, a scientific barbarianism and advanced scientific and post-Christian order was systematically created and furthered by every means possible, in particular military, educational, and scientific. What, in this scheme of things, constituted a liberal education, that is, education for true freedom as seen in terms of the cultural goals? The answer is readily apparent. It meant an education which was scientific and which called for the radical identification of the individual with the group, an abandonment of freedom in its historic sense. Soviet Russia, meanwhile, was developing its own concept of liberal education. Its educational policy has been militantly materialistic in and through every change of policy, strictly Pavlovian, ready to call even Freudian theory idealist. Scientific socialism requires scientific materialism and the enthronement of scientific methodology as the instrument of social liberation. Scientific objectivity was, as with the Nazis, more or less denied by the theory of the economic conditioning of man. Education is thus to be materialistic in the Marxist sense, scientific, and further dedicated to the service of the dictatorship of the proletariat and to world revolution. To be usable in terms of this goal, a man must be educated. In the Soviet Union, people without education are not considered people. They are just like horsepower. The link between life and school demanded by Khrushchev means that education served the aims of the Soviet state. Accordingly, the only measure of freedom open to a man is in terms of utility to the state. The result has been a desperate dedication to study as the only readily accessible escape from a grim, grinding and subhuman status in Soviet society. Any means possible, including bribery, to gain the necessary grades for educational advancements towards status in Soviet society have been readily used. Because Soviet Russia is a police state, there is no real security such as freedom makes possible. The logical end, of course, of every form of statism, however much an ostensibly welfare society dedicated to furthering security, is the destruction of every form of genuine security. In such a society, man's only hope is to become a member of the ruling class and to share in its precarious privileges, however briefly. The results in education, as in all society, is a grim competition for survival and the rule of jungle law. A fiercely competitive spirit, such as leftists normally ascribe to predatory capitalism, is the normal life of the police state. In all of this, education becomes radically divorced from learning and becomes an instrument of state and a means of social advancement. Academic freedom is an impossibility because the laissez-faire presupposition inherent in it, that is, the independence of education and learning from the state and its own integrity as a separate sphere of activity, is totally rejected. In the United States and throughout the Western world, there has been an equally strong emphasis on the group or the state and on education in terms of utility to the state or group, as against the traditional faith in education in terms of utility to God. Man has ceased to regard himself as created in the image of God and insists on seeing himself materialistically as a social animal and a creature of the state. The forms of the faith differ, but the essence remains the same. The roots of this new concept of man are in part in Darwin and Freud, whose influence has led to an anti-intellectualism in a variety of forms. With respect to the role of science, the influence of Auguste Comte, 1798 to 1857, has been decisive. As Comte observed in The Positive Philosophy, ideas govern the world or throw it into chaos. In other words, all social mechanism rests upon opinion. The opinions of our age derive substantially from Comte. In contrasting the theological or fictitious form of knowledge and the metaphysical or abstract with the scientific or positive, Comte insisted on the supremacy of the last, which is strictly a methodology, and believed that true liberty is deliverance from meaning to method. He failed to recognize that his methodology had implicit in it both a religion and a metaphysics, as does every methodology, but he did give to his successors, Dewey included, an ostensibly scientific tool for dispensing with meaning and the disciplines of meaning. We have already noted the allegiance given to scientific methodology by German National Socialism and by Soviet Russia. It should be noted how extensive is the allegiance to it in the West and in the United States. Thus, for Sidney Hook, the meaning of liberalism in education is the centrality of method. Similarly, Arthur Bester, a conservative and a classicist in education, insists on identifying liberal education not in terms of meaning, but in terms of a training in method, to weigh evidence, to reason logically, and so on. It escapes Bester that prior to weighing is a standard of weighing, and prior to logical thought, a concept of logic. The Marxist insistence that an ideology predetermines a methodology has not been appreciated. It has been written off as a characteristic surely of Marxists, but liberals have a godlike objectivity. If meaning enters in, they create rather than presuppose meaning. The emphasis on scientific methodology, on method rather than meaning, has inevitable cultural repercussions. Methodology is economical. The shortest distance between 2 points is, so to speak, its constant goal. Moreover, methodology is functional. It calls for the elimination of what appears to be unessential and of duplications. Hence, a scientific sociology leads to centralization. Family, township, county, state, and even nation are costly and uneconomical duplications. Hence, man's true home and family is the world state. Furthermore, individual and cultural differences among men are deemed to be unessential to the essential mathematical equality of men, seen as similarly constructed biological entities. Hence, equality, a purely mathematical term in essence, is applied to men, and if it is challenged, it is again in the name of mathematics, that is, in terms of inequality, as though man were a fragment of an equation. American education, and virtually all education today, is committed to this methodological fallacy. It is committed to universal education on the grounds both of democratic principles and of the need to make the most of our human resources as a people. This national goal in education must be compromised in its scientific methodology by a very anti-scientific entity, the family. James Bryant Conant has, more honestly than others, stated the dilemma. Wherever the institution of the family is still a powerful force, as it is in this country, surely inequality of opportunity is automatically and often unconsciously a basic principle of the nation. The more favoured parents endeavour to obtain even greater favours for their children. Therefore, when we Americans proclaim an adherence to the doctrine of equality of opportunity, we face the necessity for a perpetual compromise. Now, it seems to me important to recognise both the inevitable conflict and the continuing nature of the compromise. It should be noted that Conant believes both in the inevitability of the conflict between that anti-democratic institution, the family, and the democratic state, and in the necessity for a perpetual compromise. Others facing the same problem have been less pass-bound and have rejected compromise, as in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. The increasing hostility to local control of education in the United States and the demand for federal aid has, in part behind it, a distrust of the local power of anti-democratic and methodologically uneconomic and non-functional groups such as the family, the church, local clubs, lodges, business, and other interests. The triumph of methodology has thus been the enthronement of anti-meaning. Thus, in a 2.5 hours conversation by 6 prominent Stanford faculty members on the problem of the relationship of the humanities and the sciences in the modern American university, the discussion was in essence financial and administrative, in short, methodological. When it was observed that it's hard to justify classics and folklore in terms of national defence, it was with reference to securing further federal funds, such as studies under the National Defence Education Act. The differences thus in Nazi German, Soviet Russian, and Western scientifically oriented educational philosophies are, while very real, nonetheless differences in degree rather than in kind, all alike regarding methodology as basic to the education of the truly free man as each defines it. The West, however, has presented a mixed picture in that older views of liberal education have coexisted with or extensively leavened the new methodological orientation. An able champion of this older concept, Robert Maynard Hutchins, has stated, "The aim of liberal education is wisdom. This wisdom is appreciation of and participation in the great moving ideas of Western culture, but basic to this classical concept of liberal education is the radical syncretistic and anti-historical belief that Western culture from the Greeks to the present has been one culture. The West has been a battlefield of very diverse and hostile cultures. What constituted the freeman in Greek and Roman cultures sharply differed from Christianity's conception of the freeman. The various forms of Christianity and the Enlightenment also differed in their concept of the freeman and of liberal education. Much of the continuing weakness of Western cultures has been due to retrogressive educational practice, to the continued use of the Greek concept of a liberal education, which had meaning in terms of Greek society in cultures radically alien to Hellenism. In such cultures, Greek liberal education has successively and successfully acted as a destroying power. Progressive education was justified in its hostility to traditional education as essentially alien to the modern era, but for answer, it turned it first to the classical Greek tradition, to the mystical Greek tradition, from an emphasis on the Greek arts and sciences to an emphasis on Greek enthusiasm, the mystical and religious use of the dance, drama, physical education, and other activities. Traditional liberal education has thus been consistently anti-liberal because, in essence, alien to the current cultural concept of the free man. A few instances can be cited. With the rise of Rome, civilization generally found a new basis, one previously existing mainly among the Jews: law. The Jewish and Roman concepts of law differed, but both cultures rested on law and made law basic to social and personal emancipation. Every Western culture since, save Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, which sought a return to the corporate state, has been established on one or another of these concepts of law. In spite of this, law has had scant attention in liberal education. In terms of Greek society, literature and music have outweighed, in traditional thought, the significance of law. But a liberal education cannot exist in view of the present nature of the West unless it asks and answers satisfactorily the question, what is law? The essentially religious nature of every culture must again be dealt with. What are the religious presuppositions of a culture? Are they valid, and are we aware of our pre-theoretical religious commitments? Economics, again, is basic to life in a radically interdependent world wherein man's relationships to his fellow men are heightened and, at the same time, his ability to specialize and individualize his existence increased. A liberal education which bypasses economics is destined to become a slave's education. Again, science has given man not only the ability to create great technological tools, but also, sometimes very unhappily, to become reshaped by his own creations. Thus, television is made by man, but it then proceeds to reshape man. Men bring highways into their isolated communities and then are permanently influenced by those highways. Man cannot thus create blindly as though he were a god capable of meeting every contingency, but must create under God with wisdom, humility, and an awareness of the double edge of his activities. Ecology is thus a necessary discipline to freedom and important to a liberal education. From even this hasty survey, it is apparent that traditional concepts of liberal education, because they are often pre-Roman, are certainly inadequate for our era and in essence hostile to every aspect of modern culture. Their route certainly constitutes one of the clearest gains from the modern philosophies of education, however inadequate their substitution of pragmatism or other forms of the methodological faith of positivism. However, nothing can be more ill-advised than the attempt of some Christian thinkers to champion the classical concept. It is a nullification of the victories of Augustine, Anselm, and Calvin. The attempt of secular thinkers such as Walter Lippmann to champion the old cause is again futile. It is a centuries-old corpse, rapidly turning to dust. But man cannot live by bread alone, nor by methodology alone. As a result, the exaltation of the group, whether humanity, democracy, the proletariat, or the folk, has steadily become religious, and the state school a religious institution. As pointed out in Intellectual Schizophrenia, the public school is the established church of today and a substitute institution for the medieval church, and dedicated to the same monolithic conception of society. Some years ago, Dewey very candidly discussed education as a religion. Commenting on this, John S. Brubaker has observed, "What now of making education the object of religion? In religion's long history, many things have been declared to be God. At a time when race, nationality, and the state have each been raised up as objects of worship, one could certainly do worse than to make education a religion. The fundamental principle of faith of such a religion would be belief in the possibility of human achievement. Education would then become at once the symbol of humanity's as yet unrealized potentialities as the means of its salvation. Such a religion, however, would have the drawback of the political religion already mentioned. It would only be fragmentary. It would be worshipping the part for the whole. This might be a misdirection of religious endeavour if religion be taken, as it generally is, to denote inclusiveness of viewpoint. On the other hand, at least one outstanding advantage could be claimed for such a religion. It would not be in conflict with science. On the contrary, it would be based on science. Indeed, without the invigorating vitality of science, such a religion would be in danger of lapsing into the dogmas of pedagogy and the rituals of educational administration. At all events, in view of man's innumerable previous mistakes and discouraging backslidings, it takes courage, if nothing else, to hold to a faith in education as a religion. The issue lies deeper, however. If education is in any sense a preparation for life, then its concern is religious. If education is at all concerned with truth, it is again religious. If education is vocational, then it deals with calling, a basically religious concept. It would be absurd to reduce preparation for life, truth, and calling to an exclusively religious meaning in any parochial sense, but it is obvious that these and other aspects of education are inescapably religious. As Whitehead observed, the essence of education is that it be religious. The public or state schools have thus been inescapably religious. Their common faith has been described as made up of elements provided by Rousseau, Jefferson, Auguste Comte, and John Dewey. Civil religion is an apt designation for this faith. As one educator has observed, America's faith in education has been called by a European visitor the national religion of America. Not only is education a new religion, but it rests on a specifically anti-Christian doctrine of man. What is perhaps most important, the entire educational enterprise today is based not on the assumption of the wickedness of child nature, but on the child's natural human goodness and almost infinite improvability. It has a full-fledged soteriology, faith in the power of education, As a result, delinquency in the child or adult is not an evidence of sin or any desire to do evil, but is rather an aspect of learning experience, since all behavior is developmental. As a result, maladjustment or delinquency is to be traced to such causes as poor health, intense worry, frustrated needs, overloaded life schedules, rigid class structures, environment, instructors' disregard for the learning process, inadequate preparation for the learning experience, unreasonable pressures in the form of unreachable standards, unfair competition, scholarship tests, since overemphasis on test results frequently leads to nervousness and maladjustment, and so on. From all this, it follows that teachers and parents are to blame rather than the children, for according to Margaret Mead's studies, educators can infer that the status of children is a function of the environment and that youth respond accurately to the cultural conditions about them and become products of those conditions. It is apparent that any religion which frees man from the burden of original sin also frees him from the burden of responsibility. Responsible man gives way to man, the pawn of environment and heredity. Here, the old conflicts between pagan philosophers and Christian thinkers, culminating in Augustine's writings, is reproduced. When man is freed from God and his eternal decree, man does not thereby eliminate the problem of evil. By denying his culpability, man denies his responsibility, and therewith his manhood. As a consequence, the pagan philosophers ended by destroying the dignity of man which they sought to establish, whereas Augustine, with his insistence on predestination and original sin, restored responsibility, order, and manhood. To assert the basic neutrality of man does not serve to avert this dilemma. Neutral man is bland and blank man, whose direction of developments is again a social product. But whenever and wherever the doctrine of total depravity, with its analogue total responsibility, is eroded or absent, then responsibility, which is essential to social order, devolves upon the state. Hellenic culture was thus thoroughly statist, and the religious entity was the polis, the city-state. Aristotle believed in the adaptation of education to the form of government because the citizen should be moulded to suit the form of government under which he lives. Education should be public or statist, not private, because education must be the business of the state. We must not suppose that any one of the citizens belong to himself, for they all belong to the state and are each of them a part of the state, and the care of each part is inseparable from the care of the whole. Since responsibility is, in this faith, a state affair, man is not man apart from the state or the group. For Aristotle, as we have seen, the care of the citizen was inseparable from the care of the state. This is again an article of faith in the new civil religion. Thus, Melby and Ben assert, we tend to associate freedom with lack of social responsibility. In reality, true freedom has a social origin. A person who is alone is not free. Man's freedom has been developed through his interaction with other personalities. According to Kelly and Rassi, man then is a social creature or he is nothing. Man is free, thus, only through the group. The biblical doctrine of Adam, who first had to know himself and develop his sense of vocation in radical isolation, is of course denied. The theocentric constitution of man, created in God's image, and his need for privacy in order to grow in terms of God rather than man, is denied by the civil religion with its emphasis on the social constitution of the human personality. It speaks instead of the fact that everyone needs to belong. Everyone needs to belong, and the state is man's true society, and the world commonwealth his sacred city. Much earlier, Nietzsche, in his attack on statist education, declared that the interest of the state in education is to ensure that the masses follow the guiding star of the state. In such thinking, freedom means freedom for the state, and true education is in terms of citizenship and service to the sovereign state. Since in civil religion the state is God and there is no right beyond the state, or the state's concept of its goal and the goal for humanity, it follows that right is what the state requires, and the normal or healthy man that which the society requires man to be. Bryson, from 1935 to 1953, professor of education at Columbia University, has stated it thus. One of the great contributions to our thinking about this was Ruth Benedict's famous book, Patterns of Culture, a book happily that was read by millions in paperback editions. Mrs. Benedict made it clear that most of us are normal and that the normal person finds it easy to live by the rules and expectations of its tribe, whatever they may be. The striking differences which the anthropologist finds among the various peoples of the earth, modern or ancient, primitive or developed, are not caused by differences in race or by any other physical difference. They are all normal patterns, and had he changed to be born in a society in which they were accepted, any normal person would have learned happily to adjust to them. By moulding and forming the varied and adaptable natures of most of the young people in any society, education aims to make normal persons of them. According to Benjamin, the end products in education should be human beings who have been substantially changed by their years of schooling. This substantial change is being wrought with the results that mass man, dedicated to radical conformity, is the normal product of statist education. Thus, Dirk Jellema, in reporting on the composite attitudes of college students, reported these questions and answers. Question: what is the purpose of education? Answer: to enable the student to adjust to the group and thus gain emotional security. Question: but to what group should the student be trained to adjust? Answer: to the dominant group in this country. Question: and what does it want? Answer: a high standard of living. Question: is this good? Answer: obviously, since the group wants it. Question: is communism good? Answer: not in this country, since we don't think it is. It is good for the Russians since they believe in it. Question: is science true? Yes, since it raises the standard of living which the group believes in. It is apparent that Mortimer Smith's observation on education in California, that the primary task of this school is not education, but social conditioning, has application far beyond the borders of that state. Education is thus seen as a function of the state. Since it is a state function, it must steadily be removed from local control. This is being steadily done so that today, some 40 federal agencies are spending about $2 billion a year on programs covering nearly the entire spectrum of our schools and colleges. To be opposed to federal aid to education is, in this line of reasoning, to be opposed to education, which can only be education if its character as a function of the state is furthered. Thus, Secretary of Welfare Abraham Ribicoff could reprimand 1,000 college presidents and deans meeting in Washington for their failure to crusade for, rather than merely support, federal aid. I don't think you really care about education or are going to do anything about it. More than bad taste was involved in this outburst, which revealed clearly that, to Ribicoff, education to be education requires the entrance of federal power. But since the holy city of man is humanity, it is not enough to bring education under the authority of the national state. It must be subordinated to the United Nations. Accordingly, a United Nations resolution called a Draft Convention Against Discrimination in Education has been framed to control all education, public, private, and parochial. Only schools fulfilling the qualifications laid down by UNESCO are to be permitted. If approved, every school in every subscribing country will be under the far-reaching control of an international body and will exist only on its permission. There are those who increasingly call for the prohibition of all non-statist education, but even more significant is the curious reasoning of some who insist on the constitutionality of the right to establish and to attend private, church-run schools. Thus, the New Republic, in an editorial, went on to declare, "But we misunderstand the scheme if we think of the state as neutral. It is neutral in that it must prefer none of our many religions and cultural strains, but it is itself committed to exerting a secular, unifying, equalitarian force. While required impartially to accept the presence in society of sectarian influences, the state is nevertheless a party in the contest. To accept the principle of general support of public and private schools equally out of public funds is to abandon the mission of the state, since it removes the single most effective inducement available to the state to draw people to its system of schools and away from centrifugal systems. To this extent, it is the mission of the state to discourage parochial schools, just as it is the mission of the Catholic Church, for example, to discourage Catholic attendance in public schools." The editorial spoke of the mission of the state and its lack of neutrality, but it failed to see that this mission is a religious mission, and it is a lack of religious neutrality that characterizes this civil religion. Early in the history of the United States, the courts had no doubt that education was a function of the parents and no more a function of the state than is the begetting of children. Education was seen as an aspect of child-rearing. With the birth and development of state schools, however, the courts steadily invaded the area of parental authority, and the school came to be seen not as an aspect of family government, but of civil government. Numerous decisions established that public education is not merely a function of government, it is of government. Power to maintain a system of public schools is an attribute of government in much the same sense as is the police power or the power to administer justice or to maintain military forces or to tax. The state thus assumed an important aspect of parental authority. It is supposed by many that the ground of this assumption is the welfare of the child. The courts, on the contrary, have made clear that it is in terms of the welfare of the state. The primary function of the public school, in legal theory at least, is not to confer benefits upon the individual as such. The school exists as a state institution because the very existence of civil society demands it. Of course, civil society existed securely in the United States and elsewhere before state schools were established. Its very existence demands it only when the state becomes the civil religion, the father of its people, and the ground of their true existence. In recent years, the courts have done much to erode and deny the validity of absolutes. The late Chief Justice Vincent declared, "Nothing is more certain in modern society than the principle that there are no absolutes." One certainty which has not been eroded, but rather much strengthened and developed, is the police power of the state. Statist education increasingly assumes that 1. The child is the child of the state or the property of the state, which can therefore interfere extensively with parental authority. 2. The state priesthood of educators are best able to rear the child and prepare him for life, viewed as status life. 3. Status education is alone objective and hence true, the state having the impartiality and transcendence of a god. Status education is thus entrance into the true Catholicity of the civil religion of the modern state. It is the religious ideal of the French Revolution realized. In terms of this, it is not surprising that the private life of the child and his family relationships, even when congenial, become increasingly a province of statist educators, and diaries, parental interviews, and very personal questionnaires become tools of the educator. It is to be expected then, in view of this social orientation, that an educator should declare, "An educated man is one who is well-adjusted and helpful in his community." In terms of this, basic education is criticized as not being basic, that is, aware that the fundamental fact of our time is democracy and not the creation of an intellectual elite. In some respects, the advance has been very real. The older higher education was the education of an elite who sought college education as a mark of social status. High seriousness was not common among such students. Democracy in education, while in itself in the hands of its philosophers, is hostile to middle-class ideals. In the hands of teachers, it has actually furthered the rise of middle-class education and brought a new earnestness to colleges and universities and made possible their rapid development in the 20th century. In the hands of many dedicated teachers and administrators, the new movement in education has often been an extension of the middle-class revolution. It has, however, also been an anti-cultural movement, hostile to excellence as anti-democratic. Witness thus the minority of college professors of English who suggested that the reading of Shakespeare's plays had a harmful effect on the democratic education of youth, because the bard lived under a monarchy and was therefore the representative of a totalitarian mentality. Moreover, ostensibly democratic statist education has had, by virtue of its statism, a radically anti-democratic bias. To assume the rights and need of the state to provide for its citizens is to assume the basic incompetence of man. Thus, Robinson, in questioning that basic education is truly basic, states in the course of an able analysis that, because mass education is here to stay, to insist on basic education is to cheapen scholarship by trying to make scholars of everyone. Or has he, Arthur Bester, discovered a new process for the manufacture of silk purses? What Robinson is not honest enough to add is that the non-scholars are for him the sow's ears. Similarly, George H. Henry holds that the lower one-third of pupils are a non-verbal type and hence cannot be taught to read. The result is a retreat from learning in the name of this new education. As a consequence, in many cities, schools have become custodial rather than educational institutions, subject to violence and mob control, and held behind locked doors. The purpose in retaining these children and young people, in some cases psychotics, delinquents, and even prostitutes, is the idea that the social situation provided by the school, apart from all learning, is therapeutic. Thus, pupils can graduate from high school unable to read their diploma. Yet, it is assumed that somehow, in spite of all failures, the healing situation can be created so that salvation can be socially dispensed to the state's children. This Messianic faith in education is held in circles far beyond the state and its schools. Accordingly, every group in society seeks to load the curriculum with courses and data designed to create the law-abiding citizen and perfect man. As a result, in addition to basic education and the various forms of new education, the curriculum is under the impact of demands for education in temperance, driver's training, soil conservation, hygienic practices, narcotics education, premarital or sexual education, social adjustment, personal hygiene and etiquette, personal problems, and so on. All or most of these may be good, but are they the province of the schools? Is education to become totally institutional? And do not many of these require primarily a good character more than good information in order to be achieved? Messianic institutions are not new in history, and the West has seen a variety of them. The Church early claimed prerogatives belonging to the Christ, only to be surpassed in these claims by the state. The university and school have also asserted claims, and arts has been often militantly and obsessively messianic. The school has served ably in limiting the effectiveness of the Church's claims, but only at the price of advancing often more extravagant ones. And, like all monolithic and messianic institutions, it seeks increasingly to limit the freedom of man in the name of its own freedom. A state school system, like a state church system, is unable to please all men or meet all needs. The more Catholic or democratic it strives to be, the more it must compromise the integrity of its own mission. Moreover, being unable to satisfy all, it must defend itself against enemies who are, by compulsion, within its ranks. Total systems lead to an index and an inquisition in order to maintain their strength as a total system. Their very totality hinders the freedom of inconspicuous trial and error, freedom to experiment with willing subjects, and the humility of competition. State establishment gives to particular schools or churches delusions of grandeur and a sense of historical necessity, which makes them intolerant of rivals as well as of critics. Thus, when Jerome Ellison wrote a popular article on college cheating, he was thereupon given notice by the university that his services were no longer wanted. In Holland, Michigan, the Holland Christian High School was disaccredited by the North Central Association of Colleges and Secondary Schools for refusing to include cooking and shop training in its curriculum. This became the subject of editorials in various popular periodicals, such as the Saturday Evening Post and Life. As a result, the NEA sought immediately to retaliate against publications daring to call attention to the Holland case. The National Association of Secondary School Principals recommended the ban of offending periodicals from high schools. In Chicago, however, the AFL-CIO, American Federation of Teachers Executive Council, opposed the ban. As Kandel has observed, the more professionalized the administration of education has become, the greater has been the tendency among its practitioners to become complacent and to resent criticism from any source. The rift also between administrator and teacher has grown so that the NEA, because of its administrative orientation, is now called a company union, used by administrators to bring teachers further under their control. But more important, educators have increasingly lost any goal other than more money and more federal aid. Statism is a singularly static and uninspiring God. The result has been a growing stagnation in educational thinking. Education has no real goal left. Hence, the inability now of such an important centre as Columbia Teachers College to stimulate its students. A mind out vain yields no more ore. It would be a very great injustice, however, to see the school's failure only the school shares in the general cultural crisis. Moreover, the schools are by no means primarily at fault. Their role, while very important, has not been primary. In their emphasis on man as a social product, to cite a single instance, they have merely shared in a common cultural opinion. Religious leaders, for example, who should provide leadership in another direction, have themselves echoed the dehumanization chorus. Thus, Arthur G. Coons, a United Presbyterian lay leader and president of Occidental College, has declared, "The self itself is largely or considerably a social product." He cites approvingly one writer to the effect that the fully developed individual is the consummation of a fully developed society. Thus, for him, society creates man, and not man society. Again, Randolph Crump Muller of Yale Divinity School and the Episcopal Ministry has declared, "Education is what happens to a person in community. Men become persons within community. Furthermore, an individual isolated on a desert island would not become a person." This is a radical denial of the biblical doctrine of Adam. Adam, created in the image of God rather than of society or the state, was at first in isolation from men and in a relationship to God in order that he might know himself and his calling. If society or the state makes man, then man must know himself in terms of society and the state. He then cannot be a person apart from the group, but if God created man in his own image, then it is God alone who enables man truly to know himself. The society which is equally ultimate with man is his society with God and the kingdom of God. For Coons and Miller, man is a social creature primarily, and it is his relationship to the group that makes or breaks him. But Coons and Miller are modernists. Is there a better report from other circles? The influence of Aristotle's social theory of man on the Church of Rome is well known. What about Protestant fundamentalism? Billy Graham, in a book designed to affect our peace with God, begins his chapter on the Christian and the Church with the assertion, "Man is a social animal." Graham, in this instance, has made better contact with Aristotle than with God. The impotence of his Christ is apparent when he repeats the ancient heresy. The only feet that Christ has are your feet. The only hands that he has are your hands. The only tongue that he has is your tongue. Christ is thus scarcely to be seen as Lord, and man is a social animal. The logical conclusion which Graham does not make and which educational thinkers have made, is that the social group is a kind of God, creative and redemptive. And yet, in the face of the extensive religious, political and educational enthronement of the group, church, society, state, folk, proletariat, the independent school movements has grown steadily. It is, in fact, the one area in which statism in the United States is definitely losing ground. At present, 16% of school children are not in state schools. The critical issue is increasingly being recognized. Statist education is a socialization of the child. If the state can own and socialize our children, then it can most certainly own and socialize our property. We cannot legitimately surrender our children to the state and its schools and then claim the right to withhold our property. The major concession makes objection to the lesser absurd and an instance of misplaced values. An able system of common schools provided universal education before state control existed. A treatise written in 1800 at the request of Thomas Jefferson gives a telling account not of the mere literacy, but literate capability of America. Most young Americans can read, write, and cipher. Not more than 4 in 1,000 are unable to write legibly, even neatly, while in Spain, Portugal, Italy, only 1/6 of the population can read. In Germany, even in France, not more than 1/3. In Poland, about 2 men in 100, and in Russia, not 1 in 200. England, Holland, the Protestant cantons of Switzerland more nearly approach the standard of the United States, because in those countries the Bible is read. It is considered a duty to read it to the children, and in that form of religion The sermons and liturgies in the language of the people tend to increase and formulate ideas of responsibility. Controversy also has developed argumentation and has thus given room for the exercise of logic. In America, a great number of people read the Bible, and all the people read a newspaper. The fathers read aloud to hear their children while breakfast is being prepared, a task which occupies the mothers for 3/4 of an hour every morning. And as the newspapers of the United States are filled with all sort of narratives, comments on matters political, physical, philosophic, information on agriculture, the arts, travel, navigation, and also extracts from all the best books in America and Europe, they disseminate an enormous amount of information, some of which is helpful to the young people, especially when they arrive at an age when the father resigns his place as reader in favour of the child who can best succeed him. It is because of this kind of education that the Americans of the United States, without having more great men than other countries, have the great advantage of having a larger proportion of moderately well-informed men. Although their education may seem less perfect, it is nevertheless better and more equally distributed. But that does not mean that the general education cannot be improved. The education provided then, in terms of the times, was both able and truly democratic in the best sense of that word, in that it assumed the capacity of every American child to understand and participate intelligently in the basically Christian Republican culture of the day. Modern, quote-unquote, democratic education is often radically contemptuous of most students and at lower standards, fights testing and debases education in the name of its ostensible democracy, but actual oligarchy. Local control of education is fought by this faith in oligarchical principles and the possibility of free schools discounted in horror. People are not capable of maintaining and supporting their schools. The high caliber of political thoughts in that era reflected an audience capable of understanding sustained argument. The Federalist Papers were popular arguments for the Constitution a few years earlier. Today, university students have been known to complain when compelled to read such heavy material. Moreover, education then provided for its day not only literacy, but a Christian Republican framework of reference and a general concept of law which had marked social effects. From the early 19th century to mid-20th century, the average age of the criminal has dropped from 45 to 19. This reflects far more than education. The general cultural restraint, the more disciplined family life, the more theological and authoritative ministry of the church, as well as the content of education, provided the individual with a structure and discipline which often took some time to erode, even if the person's character were alien to it. Today, the scientific barbarian has no structure or discipline to erode, hence he is very early in trouble. And the faults cannot be limited to education, nor even primarily to be laid there, however important the role of the schools. It is, basically, a failure of character. It was once assumed, as Garrett pointed out, that governments is the responsibility of a self-governing people. Today, the democratic assumption is that people are the responsibility of government. This assumption was operative as early as Horace Mann, many of whose contemporaries were radical statists. But with all of this, the successes of statist education must be clearly recognized. The scientific barbarian is still a genuinely scientific man. No better tribute to the schools exists than the vast technical competence of the average man. This is certainly due in part to the technological temper of the age, the popularity of such mechanical inventions as the automobile, radio and television, and to other factors. But the role of the school is nonetheless very real. It is absurd to believe that Russian or European schools surpass the United States in these respects, and such claims involve the use of doctored statistics. The contemporary scientific ascendancy of the United States is by no means unrelated to the caliber of the schools, and it would be wrong to think otherwise. The educational boondoggle is a very real and sickening fact, as are the existence of such college courses and in great numbers of square dance and square dancing, analysis of problems of dance education, fly and bait casting. Similar courses exist in some high schools. But, more important, the serious courses are also taught and are studied by vast numbers of youth, earnest and studious youth. The excellence of technical and vocational education is clear-cut and commendable. The failure has been elsewhere. A liberal education has not been developed, and liberal education is inevitably pluralistic. The difference between an orthodox Christian and a humanist conception of the free man is very great and is productive of a different philosophy of education. Moreover, progressivism, while justified in its challenge of the traditional and long obsolete conception of liberal education, has further clouded the issue by transferring freedom from man to society. Society, not man, is seen as a free agency, a theory which, in effect, denies the possibility of true freedom. In terms of this faith, man has been increasingly depersonalized and society deified. Dewey's quote-unquote great society produces very small men. The process, however, has not been all loss. The issues have been accordingly sharpened as never before and therefore clarified. And for the present, most people, including most critics of the state schools, are getting better schools than they deserve. The state, as yet, does not hinder men from establishing and maintaining schools to further their own faith and principles. The future has never been shaped by majorities, but rather by dedicated minorities. And free men do not wait for the future, they create it. The difficulties and problems in that venture are to them not a hindrance, but a challenge that must be met. Those critics of the schools who wait for the state or society to work on the same premise as the primacy of the group. The futility of their cause is thus foreordained. Free men do not look to the state for the opportunities and results of freedom.